do you want to maybe introduce yourself for the folks who are here so they can?
Yeah, for sure. My name is Vanshika. I just finished up my last year of law school at the University of Toronto, and my background is in medical sciences and sexual and gender-based violence discourses. So right at the intersection of this defense, which is why I am particularly passionate about it.
Farrah, do you want to introduce yourself? And then Pam, yay, I'm glad you can make it.
Sure. So my name is Farrah Khan. I use she and her pronouns. I'm a queer Muslim gender justice advocate. And I am a queer mama. And I work at Consent Comes First at TMU University. And I also am the executive director of Possibility Seeds. So excited to be here. And Pam, do you want to introduce yourself? Also a queer.
Yes. Yeah, I was going to say, Farrah and I have a few things in common, one of them being that we're queer moms. So my name is Pam, my pronouns are she and her, and I am here as the Executive Director and General Counsel of the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, which advocates for the substantive equality of women, girls, trans, and non-binary people.
Okay, so I'm so pumped to have all three of you here. Could we maybe start with, like I've sort of framed it from the perspective as someone who isn't super informed on the issue, what it felt like, but from the end of people who are experts, more informed, would one of you like to sort of introduce the issue and sort of name the discomfort that came up with it?
Yeah, I can start, and then I'm going to let the legal folks talk about the legal things. But I remember when I first saw the National Post article, I think it was 2 years ago. I think that's how Pam and I actually first started talking about certain things. As an advocate who is very concerned about these things, I was alarmed. I was very concerned. And I went to a place of, as a survivor as well, I was saying, okay, like this is not okay. We shouldn't be giving another excuse to people who commit sexual assault. And that's when I started having conversations with lawyers in my life who were like, okay, Farrah, hear what you're saying. And I often say, like, lawyers and social workers need to be closer friends because lawyers have a very specific understanding of things and social workers were like different. But there was a lot of concerns because we don't want to create more barriers for survivors to access justice. And I think that's where I would love Pam to start us off with, like, where Leaf kind of stepped into the intervention and what the conversation was, because that was the part where I was like, okay, but are we going to be okay?
Yeah, so I'll take a step back and actually just give some context for these cases. So what we saw from the Supreme Court a couple of weeks ago were decisions related to three cases that came before the court. There were three men who had taken some amount of either magic mushrooms with alcohol or prescription drugs. So specifically a drug called Wellbutrin, which is supposed to help you stop smoking, but has some known psychotic side effects. And they took these drugs and they ended up in an erratic state, and they subsequently violently attacked other people. Two of the individuals stabbed their parents, and one broke into the house of somebody he did not know and assaulted them. And all three of these men were charged with various offenses. None of them were sexual assault, but they showed up to court and said, listen, I want to rely on a defense that's called extreme self-induced intoxication akin to automatism. And by that, what they meant was that they were so intoxicated by these drugs that they had no voluntary control over their actions. So their mind was dissociated from their body. And if you want to think of the example of a seizure where someone has no voluntary control over what they're doing, that's sort of the same kind of concept. And they said, I should be able to rely on this as a defense to the crimes I've been charged with, because voluntariness is a fundamental concept in criminal law. We don't convict people of offenses that they have not done voluntarily, where they have not acted voluntarily and decided to do the thing that they did. There was a law in Canada in a criminal code that said you cannot have that defense for certain crimes, including the ones that these individuals were charged with. And what the court was deciding a couple of weeks ago was the constitutionality of that law that said you cannot rely on self-induced extreme intoxication akin to automatism, the automatism defense, for certain offenses. And the court said that is unconstitutional because it allows, in part, convictions for things that were not done voluntarily. And so that voluntariness is a key concept in the Supreme Court's decision. And so it said that law that prohibited that defense has to go. And so right now, what we have is the Supreme Court having, I'm going to say, reiterated there are three key things I think I want folks to take away at this juncture. One is that there's a very rare defense that can be raised of extreme self-induced intoxication akin to automatism that has a very high bar to meet. So you have to prove as the defendant that you met that threshold, and you have to have expert scientific evidence that is accepted by the court to prove that. Very high threshold. The second thing is that the court said repeatedly in the judgment, just being drunk is not going to get you off the hook when it comes to criminal responsibility. There is, again, that very high bar. And the third thing is that the court also said, basically, it would be very rare for alcohol alone to cause that kind of automatism. And I'm gonna throw it at this point over to Vanshika, who had a really good thread explaining some of that last point in particular, and of course has other thoughts that are really valuable on this case as well.
Yeah, I'll jump in here then. Around alcohol specifically, echoing what Farrah said, 2 years ago, a lot of the headlines were that drunkenness can now be a defense of sexual assault. And that was how I got involved in the issue, because I had just finished my first year of law school. And so I had this background, having studied this very specific thing in criminal law, and also, excuse me, running in a lot of sexual and gender-based violence advocacy circles. So I had a lot of people messaging me asking, like, what's up with this? This is really bad. And so the issue, I think, there was the fact that the word drunkenness was being used, and the fact that the word drunkenness is being equated to extreme intoxication when they're not the same thing at all, not legally, not colloquially either. So as Pam said, when we talk about extreme intoxication, we're talking about like people completely out of their senses, akin to like a psychotic episode almost, that's been induced by drugs. And the reason that they can't use this defense of automatism is because that section of the criminal code just blocked all defenses related to voluntary intoxication. And so when we go back into kind of the sexual assault sphere, it's just not, it's extremely unlikely that alcohol alone is going to cause this state. And the reason for that, and the court has affirmed this, is that alcohol is a central nervous system depressant. Central nervous system depressant. It affects your entire brain, pretty just all over. And so it's not like other drugs like hallucinogens that like impact certain parts of your brain. It just shuts you down entirely. And what I talked about in my thread is that when we think about people who are extremely drunk, like their motor function is impaired. Like I know that when I've cared for people who have had too much to drink, like they're falling over and can't stand up straight. And the kinds of actions we see are like involuntary, like puking, for example. And like this is what alcohol does to your body and to your brain. It shuts you down. And this is what all depressants really do to your brain. And so the argument that I'm making, and the thing that I want people to understand, is that the level of intoxication required to prove that you were not acting voluntarily, when that level of intoxication is a result of alcohol, like that is a state you're in. You're very like not functional. You're very shut down. Your brain is completely like loses touch with your muscles, and your somatic nervous system is like just suppressed. And so like voluntary actions in general and physical actions in general are really, really hard. And so that was, I hope, helps people kind of wrap their head around why like sexual assault is not really a thing that people are going to do when they're extremely, extremely drunk, and then have this defense available to them later on. Ooh.
Yeah, I think for myself, who's not an expert and just like trying to figure this out, I think when I hear intoxication just as a word, I immediately think alcohol. So when they're like, when the headlines are like extreme intoxication, I'm like, yo, like that's fucked. Like, how can you decide that being super drunk is going to get you off? But I guess when you start framing it as like you're talking about intoxication with the use of other drugs involved, that kind of helps me better figure that out, that it's not just alcohol that we're framing here. I also think, could you explain again, like the automatism? I'm saying it wrong. I'm not going to try again, because I think that that's where a lot of people are struggling a little from what the comments that we've seen. And I feel like because it's not something most of us talk about on a day-to-day, it's not like it doesn't, yeah.
So I'll try. I understand the confusion. I also understand the concern, and it's so important that we have these conversations to be able to unpack exactly as we're doing here what this means, and ensure we're not receiving misinformation or inadvertently spreading misinformation, because all of us, I think, I hope on this call are certainly wanting to be supportive of and to give accurate information to survivors of sexual violence. The defense of what's called automatism, it really means that you don't have control over your actions. And going back to that example before of someone who's having a seizure, and you can't question, they don't physically have control over what they're doing. It's a different set of circumstances. Obviously, when somebody is functioning, like I say, well enough with their body that they go ahead and commit certain actions that cause harm to other people. But the key issue is that, to have this defense work, you have to have a scientific expert say there was a total dissociation between that person's mind and their body, such that they couldn't voluntarily, they weren't controlling what they were doing. And going back to that principle in our criminal system, that you don't convict people of crimes when they're not doing actions voluntarily. That's what this defense relates to. So if it's not voluntary, if someone's been able to prove that with that scientific expert evidence that this is automatism, that's the defense. Very high bar.
So if I'm not doing this, but if I got drunk and drove a car, crashed into something,
that is not a defense. That's not, because drunkenness is what they call an element. Drunkenness is part of the crime. So the offense is drunk driving. And so getting drunk meets part of the requirements of that offense. If you think of assault, for example, as a different one, with a different crime to which this automatism defense could apply, being drunk is not part of that offense. That offense is hitting somebody without their consent, if you can even give consent there. But being drunk and hitting somebody is not part of the crime. Being drunk and driving is the crime. So you cannot raise it, I was too drunk defense to a crime that has drunkenness as part of its, an element of its defense, of the offense.
Okay, I get drunk and I get into a bar fight. In that situation, would I be able to use extreme intoxication as like I think I'm starting to understand it better, but just for plainly repeating it,
it's okay. It's not something that's easy or intuitive, and to the extent that that it's not being communicated well, as a lawyer, I'll take responsibility for that. I think we all have our faults, especially as lawyers, using an inaccessible language sometimes, but we try. So yes, in that example, if somebody were charged with assault and they were able to prove that they were so intoxicated that they had no voluntary control over what they were doing, that disassociation between their mind and their body, that could be used as a defense. Yes, there are going to be very few cases that meet that standard, though, and that's what I really want people to hear. This is really the exception and shouldn't be thought of as the rule.
So what some of the questions we've been getting is around people taking advantage of the system, people intentionally being I'll be honest, it sounds really scary to think of a state in which your mind and your that disconnection happens, because that kind of sounds like you can't really plan what you're going to do when you get to a state like that. But what, like, is there accountability there for that person's actions? Like, it's like, I think that's what we're seeing a little bit in the chat here is like, if you choose to like take shrooms and get super drunk on alcohol and get really intoxicated and go like, tonight's the night I commit a violent crime, and then afterwards I will be able to get away with it because of this one particular law that was just passed. If all of that fit in, is that like those people just get away with it? It seems like a very like slim bucket of like a person who would fit into all those things, but for the sake of questions that we're getting.
I'm conscious of not monopolizing the conversation here, so I don't.
About legal stuff, I'll talk about sexual assault survivors. Y'all, stuff, because I think that's where it's also, just to make it, is that what it gets messy is that what we've seen is people just taking the headline and going hardcore with this around survivor stuff, which makes me nervous. And that's why we wanted to have this conversation, to make sure that we had some expertise around it. So I would love to know that question too, because I can just see it also becoming this joke, right? Like things become a joke, right? So you know what, I'm just gonna do this and then I don't have to be accountable, or people feeling entitled. So what do we say back to people who can make a joke about it or feel entitled to say, you know, now I can rationalize this. Now I can get away with this. Can I get away with it?
I say that's wrong. That is just wrong. It will be very, very, very unusual to not be held accountable in the criminal system using this defense. And one of the things that that is interesting in the court's decision is that it acknowledges and I acknowledge that in criminal cases, there will be a small number of people now who will be able to avail themselves of this defense again, or be able to use this defense again. Very, like, it's really rare. I want to emphasize that. But the court also said it's open to Parliament to create another offense, which I think they should think about very carefully in terms of whether or not they should do it and how, if they want to proceed with it, something like criminal intoxication, which would address, I think, some of the concerns that you're hearing, but I think needs to be carefully thought out in terms of how it would work in practice, of who it might potentially disproportionately target, because we, again, know so much of the criminal law is about policing Black, Brown, Indigenous, racialized bodies. So I think there's a lot of thought that needs to be given to that as well.
Yeah, I think that, sorry. But I think that addresses what you were saying around like the drunkenness isn't the crime, like the violent assault is. So I feel like that kind of starts to put pieces together in my brain to be like, okay, that's like coming together. But again, I think one of the reasons I got like all up in arms was one, the sexual assault component from headlines, but, and we're going to get to that because I feel like that's a big part of this, and where people are feeling like discomfort around. And then I think the other part was like, I'm like, okay, I know I'm talking to like two lawyers here, so I'm so sorry, but like I hate the justice system. Like I know that it exists, and I'm not saying everyone operating in it sucks. I just like, it doesn't work in the way for everyone in the same way. So then I think of like a super wealthy person who can hire an expert and pay them off, and like I watch a lot of TV, so I don't know if that is like.
I think
if I can, oh, sorry. I wanted to add I wanted to say just one thing, and then I really want to hear from Farrah about getting out of the legal system on some of these issues. Just on the idea that like absolutely access to justice varies on your wealth and social position in Canada, for sure. It's, I hope, of a little bit of comfort that experts have like certain independent duties to the court. So they, in theory, if they're respecting their ethics as experts, which I think by and large we count on them to do, they're not going to say, pay me X amount of money and I will say whatever you want me to say. They have an independent obligation to the court to be truthful and offer an independent perspective.
I'll jump in before Farrah goes out of the criminal justice system, just to add a little bit more on like making out this defense. In addition to that expert evidence, like the Crown is still able to cross-examine that expert and challenge them on what they're saying if they are arguing this. And the Crown is also able to present their own expert saying all these things. And I think one of the major things we're trying to drive home is that the evidence that alcohol can cause this defense has not been accepted in court at any point. And if this were to change, then I guess our opinions on this whole issue and our opinions on what this means for sexual assault survivors would also change. But as of now, it hasn't been accepted. It is accepted by the courts that alcohol cannot cause this state. And I also want to add that automatism as an area of the law is also separate. So you have other defenses of automatism related to mental illness, et cetera, et cetera. And the case law around that and making out this defense and proving this very high bar has also historically involved bystander testimony saying that this person was very out of it. This person was not acting like themselves. And in all three of the cases we saw last week, that was also a component. So it wasn't just expert evidence, which is a huge part of it. Don't get me wrong. It's very, very important. But it's also people who were present at the time saying, this person was not themselves. This person was clearly having like a dissociative episode. And that is also, the court has affirmed, important in like meeting this defense and reaching this really, really high bar around making out this defense. And so when we say, oh, I want to do this thing and I'm going to get really, really drunk and then try to get off on it, as Pam said earlier, or actually, I think as you said earlier, the difference between like the act of getting intoxicated and the act of doing the thing, well, if you have the intent to do the thing before you get intoxicated, like we're talking about something else entirely because you intended to do that, you wanted to do that, and it's just like, it's a different issue. We're specifically talking about things that people would not have done if not for being in that state.
That makes a little bit more sense. I feel my anxiety lessen as we continue this conversation. So maybe what we could do is start unpacking the lens from like the sexual assault, like stuff that's coming up online, and maybe frame, like look at that a bit, because I think the concerns are valid, but I think our understanding I'm learning now, our understandings are a little maybe not where they need to be because it's bigger than the headline. Farrah, do you want to maybe address some of, because I'm sure you're hearing a lot of these misconceptions.
Yeah, I think one of the hardest things I've heard of late is survivors coming to me and talking to me about sexual assault that's happened in their lives that they've been subjected to and saying, I guess I won't report now because I read this online. Have you read this post that this well-known sexual assault center did? Have you read this conversation? And so why I wanted to be a part of this conversation, and I initially was also very concerned, and I had to talk to different lawyers, and this is the thing, there needs to be public education that is better to explain how the law works and how the SEC decisions are. And it's a problem when you need a law school degree and you're talked down to if you're not a lawyer when you don't know those things. And as someone who sometimes has lawyers talk to me in interesting ways, we need to make things more accessible. Access to justice includes information, and we are failing survivors when we don't provide survivors accurate information and accessible information about decisions like this. And that's why I'm so happy that we're having this conversation. We need more of this because survivors get to know informed consent. If we're talking about consent as a part of our inherently what we need to build in this country, informed consent is a part of that. So knowing what the law is and how it works and what the impacts are and what it will mean to say something in court or have a conversation with a friend about this, or what does it mean to report, is really important. And so a couple of things that I think about with this is that we know that, I think one of the stats that comes out is that less than 90% of survivors, like a very small amount of survivors, report to the police, 10%. And the people that do report and feel safe to report are oftentimes not marginalized folks that are impacted by sexual violence. Usually they are cis white women that feel more likely that they could be heard or are being heard by police, right? And we know that racialized Black, Indigenous people, queer, trans folks, lots of people with marginalizations feel unsafe to report to the police because of long-term impacts to which the tenuous relationship or harm that's been committed by police and so-called justice services. I just call them legal services. And I think that's a piece, even a distinction for folks to do. I think that we have to also change the way people feel safe to reporting if they want to report, and increase the ability of people that are on the margins to be able to access support, be believed, not always be challenged, rape myths be continuously put on them, especially when you just want to tell somebody this thing that happened wasn't okay. And so that's a part of it for me. Another part is also looking at other ways in which we can achieve justice and actually putting resources toward that. If only 10% of survivors are speaking to the police and reporting it, then what about the other 90%? Why aren't we funneling more resources towards them? You know, in the Ontario election, there was only one party that talked specifically about rape culture, not rape culture, they talked about rape crisis centers funding. So in 2018, when the last election happened, there was a promise that there'd be a 30% increase to rape crisis centers. But the NDP is the only party that actually said that they're actually going to increase that in their party platform. So it's something I think about even around how we resource sexual assault centers, how we resource support. And when we talk about this work, we have to really think about how we're going to move forward in a way that actually supports survivors and listens to them. And if survivors want to report, there's already so many barriers. And that's why having conversations where people can understand legal decisions like this actually help survivors make better informed decisions if they want to go forward, and also trust themselves. Because oftentimes survivors will say, I know what happened to me was wrong, but I'm scared to go through the process. The process looks too difficult. No one's going to believe me because I was drinking myself, or I had sex with them before, or I wanted to make out and take my clothes off and felt really good to be naked together. But when it got to actually having like any kind of like sexual activity below the belt, I didn't want to do that. And that's where we see consent happen all the time, where sexual assault occurs, right? The research shows that oftentimes people will consent to one sexual activity, but not to another. In these cases, when it comes up like this around alcohol, we know that alcohol facilitated sexual assault is really common. And so I think that's why people also were scared, especially when Pam and I talked about this. I was talking with Leaf about my fear around university students and college students really being scared to report because oftentimes alcohol facilitated sexual assault is so common. But this is different than alcohol facilitated sexual assault. And I think we need to really piece that out. It does feel complicated. Absolutely. Even to me, like I'm still like trying to piece it out, but we need to understand that, because if we do, then we can give better information to the survivors in our lives and survivors that are listening. Because I don't know what people understand, but if 1 in 3 women, 1 in 6 men, and 1 in 2 trans and gender and binary people globally have been affected by sexual violence, there are always survivors in the room. And to pretend they're not is a mistake.
I feel like you should be in charge of all of the things.
I don't want to be, but thank you. Maybe it's my life.
Yeah, I think that I'll just I saw a really good question and I want to ask it, but before we get to that, I think it's really like when I saw all of this like outrage come out, the first thing that I was thinking was like, cool, like an election's coming up, like vote accordingly because you care about these issues and we're clearly passionate about it, and like ask your leaders what they're doing in their jobs to center the like what survivors have experienced and ensure that like survivors are able to access the resources. It always blows my mind when we react in one way but don't back it with like policy change, because you're just like perpetuating the situation to continue causing it. And I think because policy change is so daunting to everyday people, we forget that we have such an active role as not like policymakers, but just people who are passionate about these issues and care about right and wrong, to vocalize that and to make noise, because we get to influence policy in that way. And there are organizations already doing this work that you can back with your, like, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, like find those organizations, back them with money if you can, or just support the work they're doing.
Yeah, I think, I think about the National Action Plan on Gender-Based Violence that currently is being led by the federal government with violence against women, gender-based violence, gender justice, LGBTQ2S organizations. And this is an area that we could have that. Like, why aren't we reopening conversations about the criminal code? Why aren't we looking at it, how it harms and can actually help survivors and actually move this forward in a right way. You know, things like publication bans. You know, I've talked about that a lot around just the impacts of publication bans. We've seen that. There's an opportunity right now, and people should be asking provincial candidates, coming up municipal candidates in Ontario, around what's your commitment to gender-based violence? What does that look like in terms of money? What does that look like in terms of support? What does that look like in your own party? What does that look like in terms of how you're going to not only create shelter spaces, but stop the violence before it starts, so people don't have to go to shelters, that students don't have to go through the sadly what has become the rite of passage of orientation, which is being sexually assaulted. So I think, you know, this conversation, I want people to take the energy that we're taking around this conversation around this SAC decision and be like, okay, what are we asking? What does that look like, or organizing long term? This is not a short term thing. This is a long term work. I know Pam's been doing amazing work with Leaf on this, and I know you have some questions around what things need to change around the criminal justice system, criminal legal system. We can call it different things.
Yeah, I'd love to hear like what are some of the things that our communities can like mobilize around or pay attention to around the criminal code, and just in general what could be changed if our legal experts want to weigh in here, as I am a pleb and do not understand.
You're great.
I don't think that's not true. I'm confident, I'll start off by sort of picking up on what I alluded to earlier, which is not focusing exclusively or predominantly on the criminal system for justice for survivors, looking outside of the system, looking to restorative processes, looking to transformative processes, asking and receiving government commitments to fund those, and to ensuring that we listen to and work shoulder to shoulder with those who are doing, overseeing those restorative, transformative processes, to try to give survivors more options to pursue what justice would be for them, like what they want at the end of the day, rather than fitting themselves by necessity almost into systems that aren't built for them. The criminal system is not built for survivors. I think we have it, and we need to make sure that to the greatest extent possible, it is supportive of and accommodating for survivors, but it's not built to center them. And so we need to look and really engage, I think, with other options. And I know Farrah is engaged with a number of them, and it's really exciting to me to think about, as part of the National Action Plan on gender-based violence and violence against women, to look at those other options and to pursue them and to have them properly supported and properly funded.
I think that's like, that really speaks to like the larger systems, like whole approach that we need to take. And I think for people, like we're getting a lot of questions, like the one in the, can you guys see it, or is it just on my end?
Yeah, and I know Rathika, she's amazing. She's an activist at U of T, does amazing work.
Do you want to maybe speak to some of these? I feel like maybe we could go through. I just looked at the questions, and like some of them we've already touched on, but I think it might be helpful to maybe give like a shorter sort of yes, no context type of thing, because I think, I don't know, I feel better now having been sat through this conversation. I'll be honest, like it was really something that was frightening me. I'm also a survivor. Like it felt very overwhelming, but now understanding it a bit better, like I feel like the things that I'm actually more upset about are the larger issues around the legal system that like in every case need to be addressed to work for everyone. And the larger issues around the fact that we're not doing enough to prevent sexual violence from occurring in the first place, or gender-based violence from occurring in the first place. And we're not setting up a system there. So I feel like if I zoom out, that's actually what I'm mad about. And that's still consistent with or without this law. Like that's still a thing that I'm going to feel. But yeah, do one of you have an answer for this question?
Yeah, and I just want to touch on one thing is that it is okay for you as a survivor and anyone who's a survivor to be really angry at the justice system or the criminal legal system because it has failed us many, many times as survivors. And so when this comes up, it brings up those feelings about like the whole system, right? And I think that's really important for us to recognize is that we never want to devalue or say that it's not valid to feel upset about it because yeah, there's sometimes where we're just
Mm-hmm.
like burn it down and start anew. Like this is not working, right? So any survivor that's on this and is feeling that way, no one here is devaluing the anger or frustration we feel around the criminal legal system. But there's valid things we need to understand what is true and what's false about it. I think this question is not, I think Vanshika, you could do this one. Maybe.
I would be happy to. I can't actually see the question because I'm
Okay.
clearly inept with technology, but if you could read it out, I'd be happy to take it.
Yeah, do you want to read it out? Do you want to read it out or do you want me to read it?
I can read, sure, yeah. In my so the question is, in my experience in university settings, many people are mixing alcohol with other drugs, and how do we protect survivors in these situations where it's not just alcohol and the confusion around this decision?
Yeah, so really, really complex stuff. I think pulling this back into the big picture, like it's an issue of consent. It's an issue of sexual and gender-based violence in general on university campuses, and these drugs, in some ways, like facilitate this. Like it makes it easier and it makes it more common, and it's really frustrating. And I understand that there's fear around like these drugs being mixed because okay, it's not always only alcohol, and I think the thing to remember here is that with extreme intoxication, it's the words extreme intoxication make you think of a certain thing, and what we're trying to get at with from the legal side of things is that this defense is a lot more drug-induced psychosis, drug-induced automatism, and it's not really about being overly intoxicated. It's about having a really, really rare and uncommon, unexpected reaction to a drug that drug normally doesn't cause. And so the normal effects of taking these drugs are not defenses to crimes, like being a little bit out of it or being on these drugs are not defenses to crimes. It's specifically when you're having this like really rare, really unfortunate reaction that's like affecting your body and your mental state, and you're dissociating, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Yeah, it keeps feeling like there are larger issues we have to address. But like, I don't know who to add to get that to happen. Like, I feel like I don't know who to tag and be like, hello, please address this.
I have a list.
Um,
I could
oh my gosh, I would love that list.
yeah.
Um,
My
this next question is, will there be any consequences for someone deemed not criminally responsible due to intoxication? And I think, not to like pretend I know anything, but based on what we talked about, it sounded like there might be laws around intoxication that could be introduced, like criminal intoxication, but that doesn't currently exist. And that's as much as I understood from our whole conversation.
Yeah, in terms of this law specifically, as Pam alluded to earlier, the reason it was unconstitutional is because it captures these cases where it's not about sexual assault. It's not about what we were worried about in terms of intoxicated sexual violence. It's capturing these really unfortunate circumstances of people having really bad reactions to drugs and the things that resulted from that. And so it's completely on our government and our Minister of Justice and like the federal government to implement better versions of this provision or better versions of other criminal code provisions that really narrow in on violence against vulnerable people and the relation of intoxication to that, and really target, drunkenness cannot be a defense to sexual assault, for example. Like you can be really a lot more specific about it, and there's a lot of different options, a lot of various very intelligent people have written about different like ways that this could go. And I think it's really important to remember that this is a really important issue, and we should be talking about it and pressuring the government to act on it, because the intent was there. The intent of implementing this provision was to protect vulnerable people. And I think that that cause is still really important. It's just a matter of doing it in a way where other vulnerable people aren't harmed by it.
Thank you. That feels fair. If it's not clear, I'm not a professional interviewer. I'm winging it.
Are great.
You're
You're
great.
great.
Yeah.
Great for myself. In lieu of a proper transition, here's the next question. How to promote accurate or correct info to peers. So I think, yeah, this is one that I'm obviously super invested in, but what maybe the way we can phrase this, especially as we come up to the hour now, or like to our 1 hour of doing this, maybe they're like, what is something you want people to better understand about this? And if each of you can have a different answer, that'd be dope. And we'll just go around, and whoever wants to go first can go.
I can go first in terms of what I want. I think it's really important. That's why Pam and I wrote an op-ed. Vashika also wrote a really amazing op-ed as well. So I think like share op-eds, share information, but also know where the information is coming from. I think when we share things as alarmist, we may sometimes not realize that there are survivors in the room. And so people just make assumptions like they can casually talk about this. And it's like, no, you have to think about what you're saying and the impact of folks around you. And I think also it's okay if you don't know all the answers. So even in this, like, we're kind of like, not 100% sure. We're going to be figuring this out as something's going to be figured out as it moves forward, but there's things that are clear. I think the other thing is too, is if you're a survivor and you're thinking about reporting and you're worried, there's things like the ILA, which is the Independent Legal Advice Pilot Project, which is based in Ontario. If you're a survivor and you're thinking about reporting or want to talk to a lawyer, you get 4 hours of free legal advice. 4 hours with someone who's like, that can talk to you and say, hey, I want to hear what happened to you. Tell me. And you can share it and you can talk to a lawyer and you don't have to tell anybody else, but you can figure out if it feels okay to you and they could give you more information. Don't trust your family members or loved ones or even somebody who is so great and feminist and wonderful to give you that information. Talk to a lawyer that will get it and understand. And if that person isn't great, talk to another one. Come talk to a sexual assault center. They're here to support you. They're here to expand what the definition of justice looks like. We've been sold a very narrow view. Let's expand it. And I would lastly say is, you know what happened. No one else does because it was your body. You are the witness of it. So don't hesitate to report if that's something you need to do because of things like this, because it is scary, but we don't want you to be alone and there's support out there and it's not your fault. And so that would what I would want survivors to know.
Oh my gosh, can you send us, I want to promote this 4 hour thing.
Yeah.
I feel like I didn't know about that. I feel like it would have been so helpful to have access to, like, it's such a daunting, scary, not that support things aren't great to call and like have resources available, but oh my gosh. Yeah, please send that so we can just make a giant post. It's all it says is that.
Like push your provincial government and territorial government to do the same because it should be happening across Canada. People should receive free legal advice across Canada that are survivors so that there's no more barriers or fear around this process. Process sucks. It's really hard, all the things, but informed consent makes it different.
Mm-hmm. And then what's something else from our legal squad?
I mean, ditto what Farrah said, but on top of that, in terms of what we can do to promote accurate information, I mean, I take this responsibility very seriously in my role at LEAF. I think LEAF as an institution, as a national organization, has a responsibility to provide accurate information and to distribute it widely, and that's what we've tried to do in this case. And I, would encourage folks, not just in this circumstance, but I mean, increasingly, given everything that we see going on in the world, is understand which sources are sources of accuracy and are not simply sensational, and do your best to sort of sift through that and rely on sources that you are confident in. And so I think Farrah already mentioned a number of them, speaking to people who are trustworthy as accurate sources of information as well. And that's sort of the additional takeaway that I would encourage folks to sort of leave this conversation with.
Yeah, I'll on the flip side, in having these conversations, I think it's really, really important to continue validating this distrust of the justice system that survivors feel, because I think a large part of this is when we see something like drunkenness is now a defense of sexual assault, like it's believable. It's believable because of how much the justice system has let us down in the past. And it's important as legal experts, as people having these conversations in like non-legal settings, to understand where people are coming from and meeting them where they're at with this very valid like distrust, very valid doubt and hesitation when it comes to having faith in the justice system. And so it's important to get the facts right, and it's important to like know what this case is and what it isn't, what this defense is and isn't, but it's also really important to understand where people are coming from when they're really, really scared about this. And I think that starting in that place where we validate that first and then talk about it is really important when having these conversations.
Thank you. I feel like all of that is a really good like way to sort of wrap up this conversation. And this live, for people watching or people who want to tell their friends about it, will be available at least by the end of tonight for people to watch. And then by the end of the week, we'll have like a YouTube clip, like YouTube video version of it. I don't know how we do it, but someone on our team is brilliant and figures that out. So for easy sort of, sometimes I like listening to lives later, but like in the background. So that's something that people can do. And I just want to thank the three of you for doing this because honestly, like, I think I was mentioning, I don't know if I actually closed that loop with you, Farrah, but the post we wrote, because it was like done really early after the news came out, that initial post is not going to see the grid, but like we had written it in the back end, was very much written from the perspective of like, what the hell, like,
Fair.
you know. And then it was after I found your opinion piece that I was like, and then it started to clicking together, and then I started looking for more opinion pieces. But it's hard. I already knew who you were, so I had this trust in you to do that. And if you're not someone, like, I get why people are so confused, because if you're not someone who engages in this sort of stuff every day, because life is hard and we're busy and we have 1,000 things to do, you might not have a go-to expert to like be like, what is Farrah Khan, like the Farrah Khan saying about this issue, to help you better understand it. So we'll share that opinion piece in our stories as well for people to access and read. And anything else that you guys send our way, we'll amplify it. But thank you so much for doing this and helping us better understand here at the On Canada Project.
Oh no, thank you. And I really, it is so important, the work that you do to make things accessible for folks. And I hope people can follow Leaf and make sure that they follow folks that are doing the legal work. Nishika has an amazing Twitter, like us fire all the time on Twitter. And like, I just think those things are so important that we all work together to make this happen, because survivors deserve to be seen, heard, and believed. We need a better way forward around this. And right now we're not there. So it's absolutely fair, all the things that people are saying, because it's scary times.
Well, thanks, friends. And thanks everyone for tuning in. Have a good rest of your day.
Yeah,
Thanks for having us. Bye.